We're now going to talk about the animal phyla at greater length, and we're going to start with the invertebrates. The term invertebrate means lacking a backbone, or vertebra, hence the name invertebrates. And the majority of animal species actually belong to this category. So 95% of animal species are invertebrates, and so they're found in every major animal group. One of the things that comes up with invertebrates, and in general as we talk about animal phyla, is this idea that vertebrates are better than invertebrates. And so this might be just sort of our own kind of sense of mammals and primates as kind of more advanced, or our language, like using the term spineless as a negative term, for example. And it's even sort of suggested by the way that we learn about this in biology class, in that we start with the earliest types of animals and move towards the most recently evolved types of animals, being things like primates and mammals. And so, again, this can kind of lead to this misconception that we have vertebrates or other animals being better than invertebrates. And so I want to take a moment to explicitly address this. There is no end point to evolution. So evolution doesn't start with simpler animals and move towards quote unquote better animals. That's just the outline as traits got more complex. In reality, all animals are good at what they do, right? Because what we're really talking about is evolution and adaptation. And so every animal, whether it's a sponge or a jellyfish or a primate, is well adapted to its particular lifestyle. It wouldn't be around today if it wasn't well adapted to its lifestyle. And so to give you an example, right, a jellyfish might not seem that amazing to us, right? It has, as we're going to see, it has really primitive nervous system, doesn't have the ability to see or hear, things like that. Yet a jellyfish is wonderfully adapted for the life that it leads. If I were to put you in the ocean to swim around in the deep ocean and try and get you to feed on jellyfish, or feed on what a jellyfish feeds on and breathe what a jellyfish breathes, you would not do well. I think you would agree. So you are not well adapted to the jellyfish's lifestyle, but a jellyfish is well adapted to a jellyfish's lifestyle, and vice versa. Of course, if you were to bring a jellyfish and put it in our biology classroom, it would not do well either, because it's not adapted to our lifestyle. So again, remember that we're not making judgments when we talk about complexity of traits. We're not saying having this more complex structure is necessarily better. It just means that it allows that organism to be adapted to a different lifestyle. And in fact, as structures change, it allows animals to be well adapted to more and more environments on Earth. Okay. So that being said, let's talk about the earliest animals. These are the Parazoa, and they only includes phylum Porifera. So here's our cladogram. Here's the ancient animals. Remember, ancient choanoflagellates, and multicellularity leads to the earliest type of animal. That first division is the sponges, which is Parazoa, phylum Porifera. So what defines Parazoa and phylum Porifera is that they have loosely organized cells and that are not organized into true tissues. So that was the sort of key difference of Parazoa. They are truly multicellular with cell types that depend on each other. And remember, we talked about the choanocytes, which actually look really similar and function in similar ways to choanoflagellate protists, which supports the relationship between colonial choanoflagellates and the first animals. Their bodies have no symmetry. They're neither radial nor bilateral, and their body forms are irregular. So one sponge, even if it's the same species as another sponge, might have its body look really different. The adults are sessile. That's a term that means fixed in place or non-moving, but the larvae are free-swimming. So because sponges don't move, they feed in a really unique way. They have to bring the food to them, and they do this through filter feeding. And so they draw water in through their cell lining here into a hollow space called the spongocele. So water comes into this area and then it flows out through the osculum. And as it's moving this water, anything small that's in that water, so think protists, right? So small plankton in the water are passing by the cells of the sponge. So they're getting close to the cells of the sponge, and the sponge is able to use its cells to grab onto those food particles. So it has choanocytes and amoebocytes that are trapping small particles in plankton. The choanocytes are the first source of trapping, and then they pass it to the amoebocytes, who then carry it to other cells. So they're passing food from cell to cell. This is a little bit different from how other organisms are going to eat, and this is because they don't have a digestive system. Okay, so they don't have a stomach to move the food to. They have to just directly pass it from cell to cell to cell. This is a link to a video. I won't play it in this video, but you should check out this that shows how a sponge actually feeds and shows you how the water flows. Sponges reproduce sexually. Most of them are hermaphroditic. A hermaphrodite is a true hermaphrodite, I should say. And we see this quite a bit in nature, has male and female capacity for reproduction. So this is fairly unusual in like mammals. And you don't see this as a normal state for most mammals, just because our reproduction is too complex. I should say, I don't think there's any mammals that normally have true hermaphrodism, because our reproductive structures just get too complicated for one individual to have both sets of them. But in a lot of other animals, we see male and female capacity for reproduction, like all of the parts needed for both egg and sperm production. And so why is that a benefit in so many of these animals? Well, especially rare animals, it's going to help them be successful because they don't have to rely on getting exposed to one particular sex. Any other animal can mate with them and create offspring. So this can be a good strategy, especially for rare organisms. Now, in the case of the sponge, they don't actually go looking for a mate. And so they're actually relying on a sort of second sort of luck thing to happen, which is that they just release their sperm into water, and the sperm have to float to find an egg. And so in aquatic environments, a lot of animals are going to rely on this same process, just having the water move the sperm to where the egg is. Okay, and so another unusual thing about sponges is that they can actually asexually reproduce, partially because they're so simple. They don't have these tissues. A small fragment or piece of a sponge can actually detach and just go and start living separately. And so that's one way that they can asexually reproduce. If they get broken in pieces, basically, they're able to still grow. Because again, even though they are multicellular, if they have all of the necessary cell types, they don't have the tissues and the complex organization of the tissues and organs, so they're able to successfully survive that. So just an interesting aside, the word sponge actually relates to sea sponges. So the original sort of bath sponge actually did come from sea sponges. Some sponges have a skeleton they leave behind that's rich in this material called spongin, and it's that soft, spongy feeling. Not all of them have this, but again, some do. And this was what was sort of the original bath sponge. Now today, this is not very typically the sponge. So if you're using a sponge at home to clean your dishes or whatnot, those are usually either made from cellulose, from plant material like corn, or even more commonly these days, a lot of times from petroleum products. But the original sponge did come from these phylum Porifera. Okay, so I mentioned before that there's some things unique about sponges. And so one of the things about not having true tissues is that they are much more loosely connected to each other than cells in our body. So what that causes is that the sponge cells can actually be separated from each other and then will reform. So you can take their cell tissues, the cell clumps, and you can put them through a sieve, and that basically splits them all apart, and they will actually re-find each other. It's amazing. And they will lump back together and make this this little baby sponge that will then continue to grow. And again, I encourage you to see this video, which shows this process happening. And again, this is significant because it shows us that these don't have true tissues. Their connection to each other is tentative. It can be broken and reformed easily. This would not happen with, for example, your skin cells. If you were to disrupt your skin cells, they cannot just reform with each other to form a new skin tissue. Okay, and then as another note about sponges, I want to make sure we understand how they might get oxygen. So sometimes in these talk about animal features and their big body structures, we forget some of the basic stuff. Like this sponge has to carry out cellular respiration just like you and I. And so that means it has an absolute requirement for oxygen. And so where is it getting that oxygen? And just like any other aquatic animal that you might be familiar with, like for example fish, they're going to have to extract oxygen from the water. So there is dissolved oxygen in water. It comes from the air. So here's my water, here's air, right? And oxygen as well as other gases. So CO2, you may have heard of this happening with CO2. All these different gases slowly dissolve into the water. And then, of course, you also have things like algae releasing O2 into the water as well as they carry out photosynthesis. So you have all this oxygen that is in the water. And the sponges never get air. They have to extract that oxygen from the water. And they don't do it with gills, so you may be familiar with gills in fish. Instead, they're going to directly absorb it through their cells, just like they do their food. So again, because they don't have tissues and organs, they're not going to have specialized structures that do this. Their cells are just going to have to absorb oxygen directly from the water. Okay, so leaving sponges behind, and now moving on to Radiata. So these are organisms with radial symmetry, which remember means they can be divided up in any which way because they don't have like the two halves distinct like we do. This includes phylums Cnidaria and Ctenophora. We'll talk mostly about phylum Cnidaria. So jellies, coral, and anemones are all part of phylum Cnidaria, and the comb jellies are Ctenophora. Most of them live in the ocean. Remember that radial symmetry goes along with being diploblastic. So that means that the embryo has two germ layers, the ectoderm and the endoderm. That means there's no mesoderm. The mesoderm gives rise to true muscles and complex organs. So that lack of mesoderm means that they also lack true muscle and lack really complex organs. So notice that I've used the term jelly here. And so there's a movement to stop using the term jellyfish. And you've heard me use the term jellyfish still because it's a really ingrained habit. But people are trying to get away from this term because fish might suggest to people an equivalence to actual fish, which is not true. There's no relation. So jellyfish are not close relatives of fish, and that's why people have tried to change that name. We'll see the same thing has happened with starfish. People are trying to move towards saying sea stars instead to have evolutionary clearness on relationships. So Cnidarians are part of this first group with true tissues. So remember that Parazoa did not have true tissues. Radiata and all other animals do, which is what makes them eumetazoa. So all animals other than sponges are eumetazoa. They feed by absorbing ingesting large pieces of food through an opening. So on the underside of this jellyfish is an opening that it can take food into. And it's called the gastrovascular cavity. And in that gastrovascular cavity, it can then break down a large food item, including, for example, a whole fish. And then its cells are able to take that broken down fish and absorb those. So this is a big advantage over the sponge. So remember, the sponge had to its cells had to directly absorb every food item. It didn't have a place where it could break it down into small pieces. So this gives the jellies more food options. They don't have to eat plankton. They can eat fish and other large things. They do have what's called an incomplete digestive system. That means it only has one opening. So the mouth and anus are essentially the same. That opening lets stuff in and also is responsible for letting stuff out. We, on the other hand, have a complete digestive system. We have a mouth and an anus. So we have two sides. Stuff comes in one side and goes out the other side. Jellyfish can go out looking for food. So they are modal, or many of them are modal. And even if they're not modal, they're going to be able to somewhat sense their food, and we'll see that. So they have true nerve cells. So it's not as complex as our nervous system, but it is the beginnings of a nervous system that we call a nerve net that lines their tissue. There's no central control organ. So read that as no brain, basically. So remember, they're not cephalized because they have radial symmetry. So they have very sort of primitive nervous system, the ability to sense food to some degree, but not actually go hunting it. So what I mean is they don't have eyes, they don't have noses, they don't have a way to like see prey out in the distance and then swim towards it. Now, if prey like bumps into them, they can feel that, so they have a sense of touch. That's really the only sense they have. And when they feel something bump into it, then they can take that into their gastrovascular cavity. So they can find food by accidentally bumping into it, but they can't actually hunt it because they can't sense where it is unless it's already run into them. So the Cnidarian body plan can have two different forms. We see Cnidarians that are polyps in the polyp form and Cnidarians that are in the medusa form, and some actually will go in between these two forms depending on the species. So the polyp form is a tubular body, so it's more shaped like a tube. Sometimes the tube is really short so you can't see it, so like imagine like a rock, and the anemone might just more look like this growing out of the rock. That's because the tube part is really short. In the polyp form, the opening is up top and the tentacles are kind of up. And so if there's like a little fish right here, it would catch it and then bring it down like that. Polyps are sessile, so remember that means non-moving. The modal form is called the medusa. So again, that means it can move. They are oriented the opposite direction, where the opening to the gastrovascular cavity is on the bottom and the tentacles hang down from that. And then they have this bell, and the bell allows swimming. So it will pulse with fluid, and as it pulses with fluid, the jellyfish is able to move. Now remember, it's like not really directional because they don't have a reason to move any particular direction because they're not hunting, they're just bumping into stuff. And they also don't have true muscles because there's not a mesoderm, okay? But it is enough to kind of move around in the ocean, kind of float around, drift, and bump into food. And so you can see a sea anemone catch a fish like I've drawn here in this video, and I encourage you to do that. So Cnidarians, as I mentioned, they can sometimes alternate between a polyp and medusa form in their life cycle. And so I encourage you to see the moon jelly life cycle where we see this dramatic life cycle in action by following this video. Most jellies reproduce sexually, and you'll also see this in this video by releasing sperm and eggs, and 2 females that have eggs. So that's our cnidarians.